My name is Amina Hassan, and on June 12th, 2017, I died for exactly 31 minutes after ISIS soldiers shot me in my village in northern Iraq. I was 29 years old, the devoted wife of a respected Imam, mother of 3 children. What happened in those 31 minutes changed everything I believed about God, faith, and eternal truth. That morning began like countless others in our small village outside Mosul, with the call to Fajr prayers echoing through the pre-dawn darkness. I had awakened at 4 a.m. as I had every day for 15 years of marriage, my body automatically responding to the rhythm of Islamic devotion that governed every aspect of our lives. But something felt different that June 12th morning, a heaviness that pressed against my chest like an invisible weight, making each breath feel labored and uncertain. As I performed my ritual ablutions in our small bathroom, washing my hands, face, and feet in the prescribed manner, I caught sight of my reflection in the cracked mirror. At 29, I had lived my entire adult life as the wife of Imam Ahmad Hassan, a respected religious leader in our community. My days were structured around the 5 daily prayers, caring for our 3 children, and supporting my husband's ministry to the faithful Muslims in our region. I had always found comfort in this predictability, this sense of purpose that came from knowing exactly what Allah expected of me. But that morning, as I adjusted my hijab and prepared to join Ahmad for morning prayers, an unexplainable dread settled over me like a thick blanket. My husband had been increasingly anxious in recent weeks, speaking in hushed tones about ISIS suspicions regarding his teaching style, unlike the harsh, uncompromising rhetoric that the militants demanded. Ahmad had always emphasized mercy and compassion in his sermons, qualities that were now being viewed with suspicion by the extremist forces controlling our region. Our village had become a place of whispered conversations and fearful glances. Neighbors who had lived peacefully together for generations now watched each other with suspicion, wondering who might report them to the ISIS authorities for some perceived infraction of their strict interpretation of Islamic law. Children no longer played freely in the streets, and women hurried through their daily tasks with downcast eyes, terrified of attracting unwanted attention from the armed patrols that had become a constant presence in our community. As we knelt together on our prayer rugs facing Mecca, I noticed Ahmad's hands trembling as he recited the familiar Arabic phrases. His normally strong voice wavered slightly as he led our household in the morning prayers, and I could sense the fear that had been building in him for weeks. 3 families from neighboring villages had already been executed for crimes against Islamic purity, and the stories of their deaths circulated in terrified whispers among the women at the market. Our 3 children, Fatima age 8, Omar age 6, and little Zara, who had just turned 4, were still sleeping peacefully in their shared bedroom, blissfully unaware that this would be the last normal morning our family would ever experience together. I remember pausing outside their door after prayers, watching their innocent faces in the dim light filtering through our small window, feeling an overwhelming urge to wake them and hold them close. The sound that shattered our morning prayers came at exactly 6:30 a.m. Heavy military boots thundered against our wooden front door with such violence that the entire house seemed to shake. Before Ahmad and I could even rise from our prayer rugs, the door exploded inward in a shower of splinters and dust. 5 ISIS fighters in black masks stormed into our modest home, their assault rifles raised and ready, their voices harsh with accusations and rage. "Ahmad Hassan," the leader shouted in accented Arabic, his eyes burning with fanatical fervor. You stand accused of corrupting the pure message of Islam with your weak teachings about mercy and tolerance. The other militants spread throughout our small living space, overturning furniture and searching for evidence of the crimes they had already decided we had committed. I watched in terror as they grabbed my husband roughly by the shoulders, forcing him to his feet while continuing their verbal assault. You have been too lenient with the Christian dogs in this region, another fighter spat. Your Friday sermons speak of compassion when they should speak of jihad against the infidels. Ammar tried to protest, to explain that mercy was also a divine attribute mentioned throughout the Quran, but his words only seemed to inflame their anger further. The sound of our children screaming from their bedroom pierced through the chaos as the militants dragged both Ahmad and me toward the front door. Little Zahra was crying for her mama, while Omar tried to comfort his sisters with brave words that trembled with fear. The sight of their terrified faces as we were forced outside remains burned into my memory, an image that haunts me even now, years later. Our neighbors had gathered in their doorways and behind their windows, watching the unfolding tragedy with the paralyzed horror of people who knew they were powerless to intervene. These were families we had shared meals with, children who had played with our own, elderly people whom Ahmad had comforted during times of grief and loss. Now they could only watch in silence as the ISIS militants prepared to destroy our family for the crime of preaching a slightly more compassionate version of the faith we all shared. I was forced to kneel in the dusty street outside our home, the rough ground cutting through the thin fabric of my nightgown and scraping against my knees. The morning sun was just beginning to rise over the horizon, casting long shadows across the village that had been our home for 7 years of marriage. Above me, the clear blue sky seemed to mock the horror unfolding below, its serene beauty contrasting sharply with the violence about to be unleashed. The commander, a young man whose eyes held no trace of mercy or doubt, stood before me with his weapon raised. You have corrupted your husband with weak feminine influence, he declared, his voice carrying across the silent street. Your softness has made him forget that Islam is a religion of strength and conquest, not weakness and compromise. I pleaded in Arabic, the language of my prayers and my childhood, the words tumbling out in desperate succession. Please, I am a faithful Muslim woman. I pray 5 times daily. I fast during Ramadan. I follow all of Allah's commands as written in the Quran. But even as I spoke these words, I could see in his eyes that my fate had already been decided before they had even entered our home. The single gunshot that ended my earthly life rang out across the village like a judgment from heaven itself. I felt the bullet tear through my chest, a burning sensation that quickly spread throughout my entire body. As I fell backward onto the hard-packed earth, my last earthly sight was of my own blood beginning to soak into the dry Iraqi soil that had nourished our crops and sustained our community for generations. The moment the bullet struck my chest, everything changed in ways I could never have imagined. The chaos that had filled our village street just seconds before was instantly replaced by a silence so profound and complete that it seemed to have substance, weight, presence. This was not merely the absence of sound, but something far deeper, a silence that felt sacred and eternal, as if I had stepped across an invisible threshold into a realm where noise itself could not exist. I found myself rising above the tragic scene unfolding below, floating with impossible lightness somewhere near the rooftops of our modest village homes. Looking down, I could see my own body crumpled in the dusty street, blood spreading in a dark pool around my chest and head. The sight should have filled me with horror or grief, but instead I felt only a strange detachment, as if I were observing the death of someone I had once known but no longer was. My husband Ahmad was on his knees beside my lifeless form, his hands pressed desperately against the bullet wound, his mouth open in what I assumed were screams of anguish, though I could no longer hear his voice. The ISIS militants had stepped back to admire their work, their masked faces showing satisfaction at having eliminated another perceived threat to their twisted version of Islamic purity. My 3 children had somehow broken free from wherever they had been restrained and were now running toward my body, their small faces contorted with terror and confusion. The most heartbreaking sight was little Zara, barely 4 years old, tugging at my blood-stained nightgown and trying to wake me up. Her innocent mind could not comprehend that her mama would never again respond to her calls, never again hold her close during thunderstorms or sing her to sleep with gentle lullabies. Omar was attempting to be brave as the eldest son, but tears streamed down his face as he shook my shoulders with increasing desperation. 8-year-old Fatima simply stood frozen, her dark eyes wide with the kind of trauma that changes a child forever. I tried desperately to reach out to them, to somehow communicate that I was still present, still aware, still their mother despite what had happened to my physical form. But my voice made no sound that they could hear, and my spiritual hands passed through their small bodies like mist through sunlight. The realization that I could no longer comfort my children, could no longer protect them from the horrors of this world, filled me with an anguish deeper than any physical pain I had ever experienced. As I watched the scene below, I gradually became aware that I was descending into something far different from the peaceful floating I had initially experienced. A darkness began to envelop me, not this simple absence of light, but a thick, oppressive blackness that seemed alive with malevolent intent. This darkness had texture and weight, pressing against me from all directions, making me feel claustrophobic and trapped despite the vastness of the space I seemed to be occupying. In this suffocating void, my first instinct was to call upon Allah as I had been taught to do in times of distress and fear. I began reciting the verses from the Quran that had comforted me throughout my life, starting with the opening chapter that every Muslim knows by heart. In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. Praise be to Allah, the Lord of all the worlds. But as these familiar words left my lips, they seemed to disappear into the darkness without echo or response, as if the void itself was swallowing them before they could reach their intended destination. I tried again, this time reciting the verse of the throne that speaks of Allah's sovereignty over all creation. Allah, there is no deity except Him, the ever-living, the sustainer of existence. Still nothing. The words that had anchored my faith for 29 years felt hollow and powerless in this place, offering no comfort, no sense of divine presence, no assurance that I was heard or protected. Growing more desperate, I called out the 99 beautiful names of Allah that I had memorized as a child, hoping that one of them would pierce through this terrible silence and bring me the peace I had always associated with proper Islamic worship. Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, Al-Malik, Al-Qudus. I cried into the emptiness, but each sacred name seemed to fall dead in the darkness, bringing no response, no warmth, no sense of connection to the divine being I had devoted my entire life to serving. The silence that greeted my prayers was more terrifying than any earthly persecution I had ever witnessed. This was not the silence of an absent God, but something far worse, the silence of complete spiritual isolation. For 15 years of marriage, 29 years of life, I had prayed 5 times daily, fasted during Ramadan, given charity to the poor, and sought to live according to every commandment I believed Allah had given. Yet now, in what I assumed was my moment of greatest need, those prayers brought no comfort, no peace, no sense of divine presence. Have you ever felt completely lost in darkness, calling for help that never comes? Have you experienced that moment when everything you believed about God, about prayer, about divine protection suddenly feels hollow and meaningless? That was where I found myself in those first moments after death, surrounded by a darkness that seemed to mock every act of worship I had ever performed. But then, just as despair began to overwhelm me completely, I noticed something that changed everything. Far in the distance, almost beyond perception, a faint glow began to appear. This was not the harsh light of the sun or the flickering flame of a candle, but something entirely different, something that seemed to pulse with life and warmth and an inexplicable sense of love. As I focused on this distant light, it began to grow brighter and closer, cutting through the oppressive darkness like the dawn breaking over a landscape that has been trapped in eternal night. But this light was not approaching me, I realized. Rather, it was calling to me, drawing me forward with an irresistible attraction that felt like the pull of home after a lifetime of wandering in foreign lands. The voice that spoke my name came not in Arabic, the language of my prayers and my culture, but in something far more fundamental, a communication that transcended words and spoke directly to my soul. Amina, it called, and the sound of my name carried such tenderness, such perfect love and acceptance that every fiber of my being trembled with recognition. My first thought was that this might be a trick, a deception sent by Shaitan to lead me away from the righteous path. Everything I had been taught about death and the afterlife suggested that this experience was not following the proper Islamic sequence of events. Where was the angel Hazrael, who was supposed to separate my soul from my body? Where were the questions about my faith that I was supposed to answer before proceeding to judgment? Yet as I drew closer to the source of that loving voice, as the light grew brighter and more welcoming, I found myself unable to resist its call. There was something about this presence that felt more real, more true, more genuinely divine than anything I had ever experienced in all my years of faithful Islamic worship. This was not the distant, demanding deity I had spent my life trying to please, but something infinitely more personal, more loving, more present. As I drew closer to the source of that radiant light, the oppressive darkness that had surrounded me began to dissolve like shadows before the rising sun. The light itself was unlike anything I had ever witnessed in the physical world. It was not merely illumination, but seemed to be composed of pure love, joy, and peace made visible. Each ray that touched me carried warmth that penetrated not just my spiritual form, but the very essence of who I was, healing wounds I had not even realized I carried. The figure that emerged from this divine radiance took my breath away, though I no longer possessed lungs to breathe. This was not the European Jesus depicted in the Christian images I had seen and dismissed throughout my life. Instead, I beheld a man with the olive skin and dark features of Middle Eastern heritage, someone who could have walked through the streets of my village without drawing a second glance. His hair was thick and dark, his build strong and purposeful, like a man who had worked with his hands, yet his entire being radiated an authority and majesty that made me understand immediately that I was in the presence of divinity itself. His eyes were what captured me completely. They held depths of compassion that seemed to contain all the love that had ever existed, combined with a wisdom that spoke of having witnessed every moment of human history from the very beginning. When those eyes met mine, I felt completely seen, completely known, as if Every secret thought, every hidden struggle, every moment of doubt or joy from my 29 years of life was laid bare before his perfect understanding. Light emanated from his entire form, not harsh or blinding, but gentle and welcoming, like the first rays of dawn after the darkest night. His presence filled the space around us with an authority that was absolute yet never oppressive, the kind of power that creates galaxies and sets atoms spinning while simultaneously knowing the number of hairs on every human head. This was royalty beyond any earthly throne, divinity beyond any human conception, yet somehow completely accessible and personal. The moment I realized who stood before me, every assumption I had held about Christianity, about Jesus, about the nature of God Himself, crumbled like sandcastles before an ocean wave. This was not the false prophet I had been taught to reject in countless mosque sermons. This was not the corrupted teaching that my Islamic education had trained me to dismiss. This was truth itself standing before me, and the recognition hit me with such force that I fell to my knees, or what would have been my knees if I had possessed physical form. Amina, he said, and his voice carried the music of creation itself. I am Jesus, whom you have been taught to reject, but I have always loved you. As these words washed over me, I felt the walls of religious conditioning that had defined my entire worldview begin to crumble. The Jesus I had been told was merely a prophet, a good teacher whose message had been corrupted by his followers, stood before me as the living embodiment of divine love and truth. He extended his hands toward me, and I saw the scars, the wounds that marked where nails had pierced his flesh. In that instant, I understood with clarity that transcended any theological argument that these wounds had been endured for me, for every human soul who had ever lived or would live. The concept of substitutionary sacrifice that I had rejected as impossible and unnecessary suddenly became the most beautiful truth I had ever encountered. These wounds, he said, his voice gentle yet filled with infinite strength, were not just for those who call themselves Christians, they were for you, Amina, for every prayer you offered in sincere seeking, for every moment you genuinely tried to serve God, for every act of love you showed to your children and neighbors. The realization that this divine sacrifice included me, a Muslim woman who had spent her life believing Jesus was merely a prophet, overwhelmed me with a mixture of gratitude and grief. As he spoke, images began to flow between us like living movies, scenes from my life that played out with startling clarity and detail. I saw myself as a young girl in mosque, genuinely seeking to please Allah through perfect recitation of Quranic verses. I watched my wedding day, my sincere desire to be a faithful wife and devout Muslim woman. I observed my children's births, the pure love I felt for them, my determination to raise them according to what I believed were God's commands. But then he showed me scenes that filled me with shame and horror. I saw myself watching television broadcasts of ISIS executions, feeling a secret satisfaction when Christian infidels were killed for refusing to convert to Islam. I observed my own heart when Christian neighbors were arrested and disappeared, how I had convinced myself that they deserved their fate for rejecting what I believed was the true religion. You were sincere in your devotion, Amina, Jesus said with infinite compassion, but you were devoted to a distorted image of who God really is. As he spoke, I saw how my religious education had emphasized God's wrath and judgment while minimizing his love and mercy. I had spent my entire life trying to earn divine approval through perfect religious performance, never understanding that God's love was freely given rather than carefully earned. The most devastating revelation came when he showed me the moments I had felt pride watching other human beings suffer for their faith. I saw myself turning away when Christian families in our village were persecuted, telling myself that they brought their suffering upon themselves by refusing to accept Islam. The contrast between my self-righteous satisfaction at their pain and Jesus' obvious love for both them and me was almost too much to bear. I never taught hatred of those who believe differently, he continued, his voice carrying gentle correction rather than harsh condemnation. My message has always been love for God and love for all people, including those who reject me. In that moment, I understood how far my understanding of God had drifted from his true nature, how religious pride and cultural conditioning had blinded me to the very heart of divine character. Yet even as these painful truths were revealed, I felt no sense of condemnation or rejection from Jesus. Instead, his presence emanated pure acceptance, unconditional love that was not dependent on my religious background or past beliefs. He loved me not despite my Islamic faith, but because of my sincere heart that had always sought to serve God, even when my understanding was incomplete. Have you ever realized that everything you thought you knew about God was only a partial truth? Have you felt the shock of discovering that divine love is far greater, far more inclusive, far more personal than anything you were taught in your religious education? That was the overwhelming reality that crashed over me as I knelt in the presence of Jesus Christ, understanding for the first time that the God I had spent my life trying to please was actually calling me into a relationship I had never imagined was possible. As the profound reality of Jesus' identity settled into my consciousness, he began to show me visions that completely transformed my understanding of love, faith, and divine purpose. The first images that flowed between us revealed Christians I had despised and dismissed throughout my life, but now I saw them through his eyes rather than through the lens of religious prejudice that had clouded my vision for so long. I watched in amazement as scenes unfolded of Christian families in our region secretly gathering to pray for their Muslim neighbors, including my own family. While I had been celebrating their persecution and arrest, they had been interceding for our protection and salvation. I saw elderly Christian women whose sons had been imprisoned for their faith, kneeling in hidden basement rooms and weeping as they called upon Jesus to show mercy to the very Islamic authorities who had destroyed their families. The vision shifted to show me Christian aid workers who had arrived in our area during the worst of the ISIS occupation. These men and women who risked their lives daily to bring food and medical supplies to refugee families served Muslims and Christians alike without discrimination. I watched them tenderly caring for wounded Islamic fighters who had been abandoned by their own comrades, cleaning their wounds and offering water to men who would have killed them without hesitation. This is what love looks like, Amina, Jesus said, as we observed these acts of radical compassion, not rules and fear and performance, but sacrifice and service offered freely to those who cannot repay it. I saw Christian nurses working 18-hour shifts in makeshift hospitals, treating Muslim children with the same tenderness they would show their own sons and daughters. I witnessed Christian teachers secretly providing education to young Muslim girls whose schooling had been banned by ISIS extremists. The most devastating revelation came when he showed me a young Christian woman named Sarah, whom I had personally reported to the Islamic authorities 3 years earlier. I had seen her sharing food with refugee families and suspected her of trying to convert Muslims through acts of kindness. My report had led to her arrest, torture, and eventual execution for refusing to convert to Islam and renounce her faith in Jesus. But instead of showing me her suffering, Jesus revealed what had been in Sarah's heart during her final moments. As she faced death for her beliefs, she was praying not for rescue or revenge, but for the salvation of the very people who were about to kill her. She had specifically mentioned my family by name, asking Jesus to reveal himself to us in a way that would open our hearts to his love. She died praying for you, Amina, Jesus said with infinite tenderness. While you celebrated her death as justice against an infidel, she was offering her life as a seed that would one day bear fruit in your own salvation. The weight of this revelation nearly crushed me. This young woman whom I had condemned as an enemy of God had loved me enough to die while praying for my eternal well-being. The visions continued, showing me how my own understanding of God had been shaped by fear rather than love. I saw myself as a young bride, terrified of displeasing my husband because I believed that his anger reflected Allah's displeasure. I watched my interactions with my children, how I had taught them to fear God's punishment more than to trust in his mercy. Every aspect of my Islamic faith had been filtered through a lens of a performance and anxiety rather than relationship and peace. I never came to destroy Muslims or any people, Jesus explained as he showed me followers from every nation and background throughout history. I came to bring life to all human beings, to reveal what God's heart truly looks like. I saw early Christians loving their Roman persecutors. I witnessed believers in China caring for Buddhist neighbors. I observed Muslim background followers of Jesus in Indonesia serving their former Islamic communities with radical love. The revelation that shook me most deeply was understanding how my religious pride had actually separated me from the very God I thought I was serving. I had spent years feeling superior to Christians because of my Islamic devotion, convinced that my 5 daily prayers and strict observance of religious laws made me more pleasing to Allah than those who followed what I considered corrupted teachings. You thought you knew Allah, Jesus said with gentle correction, but you knew only a shadow of who I really am. He revealed that the distant, demanding deity I had spent my life trying to appease was a distortion of his true nature. The God who had created me desired relationship rather than mere ritual, love rather than fearful compliance, trust rather than anxious performance. For the first time in my life, I felt unconditional acceptance from the divine. There was no list of requirements I needed to fulfill, no religious hoops I needed to jump through, no cultural standards I needed to maintain. Jesus loved me simply because I existed, because he had created me, because I was precious to him regardless of my religious background or past mistakes. The peace that flooded my being was unlike anything I had ever experienced through Islamic worship. Despite 15 years of faithful prayer, fasting, and religious observance, I had never felt the deep soul rest that now surrounded me like a warm embrace. This was not the temporary relief that comes from completing religious duties, but the eternal security of knowing I was completely loved and fully accepted. Your heart was always seeking this love, Jesus continued, but you were looking for it in the wrong places. Every sincere prayer you offered, every act of kindness you showed, every moment you genuinely sought to honor God was actually your soul crying out for this relationship. I understood then that my Islamic devotion had been like a person dying of thirst while standing next to a flowing river, desperately trying to satisfy my spiritual hunger through religious activity while the source of living water stood waiting to be received. He showed me Muslim women throughout the world who were at that very moment questioning their faith, sensing that something was missing despite their religious faithfulness. I saw them in Iran, in Pakistan, in Somalia, in countless nations where Islamic culture dominated, but where hearts remained restless for the love they had never fully found. When did you last feel loved without conditions, accepted without performance? Have you ever experienced the peace that comes from knowing you are treasured simply because you exist, not because of what you do or don't do. That was the reality Jesus was offering me, a love so pure and complete that every religious system I had ever known paled in comparison. This love is not reserved for any particular culture or religious background, he explained. It is the birthright of every human soul ever created, including those who have spent their lives unknowingly seeking me through other faiths. I realized that the love I was experiencing was not special treatment for a select few, but the very nature of God Himself, available to anyone willing to receive it. The transformation happening within me was not just intellectual understanding, but a fundamental change at the core of my being. And the fear that had motivated so much of my religious life was being replaced by trust. The performance anxiety that had driven my spiritual practices was dissolving into grateful response. The distance I had always felt from Allah was being bridged by the intimate presence of Jesus. After what seemed like hours, but could have been moments or centuries in that timeless realm, Jesus turned to me with an expression that combined infinite love with gentle authority. The radiance surrounding him seemed to intensify as he prepared to speak words that would fundamentally alter the course of my existence, both in this eternal dimension and in the earthly life I had left behind. Amina, my beloved daughter, he said, his voice carrying the weight of divine purpose, your time in eternity is not yet complete, but your time on earth is not finished either. As these words settled into my consciousness, I felt a mixture of confusion and growing apprehension. How could my time in eternity be incomplete when I had just discovered the very source of life itself? The thought of leaving this place of perfect love and acceptance felt like being asked to abandon paradise for exile. I don't understand, Lord, I responded, my spiritual voice trembling with emotion. How can you ask me to leave when I have finally found what my heart has been searching for my entire life? The irony was profound that I, who had just experienced physical death, was now feeling truly alive for the first time in my 29 years of existence. Jesus smiled with that infinite compassion I had come to recognize, and suddenly our surroundings shifted dramatically. Instead of the realm of pure light and love we had been inhabiting, I found myself looking down at the heartbreaking scene that was unfolding in the physical world below. There, in the dusty street of my village, lay my lifeless body, surrounded by chaos, grief, and confusion. Look more closely, my daughter, Jesus instructed, and my spiritual vision sharpened to perceive details I had been unable to see during my initial separation from my physical form. My husband Ahmad was kneeling beside my body, his hands pressed against the bullet wound in my chest, but his lips were moving in fervent prayer. However, these were not the Islamic prayers I would have expected. Instead, he was crying out in desperation to the very Jesus who now stood beside me. Jesus, if you are real, Ahmad was whispering through his tears, please bring her back. I cannot raise our children alone. Show me if what the Christians say about you is true. His faith was cracking under the weight of this tragedy, and I could see the questions that had been buried beneath years of Islamic teaching beginning to surface in this moment of desperate need. My 3 children were huddled around my body, their faces contorted with a grief too profound for their young ages to comprehend. But as I watched more carefully, I noticed 8-year-old Fatima whispering words that made my heart both break and soar. Mama always said God loves us, she was telling her younger siblings. If Mama goes to God, then she must be safe now. Even in her trauma, she was clinging to the simple faith that had somehow survived despite our Islamic upbringing. The scene expanded to show me the ISIS militants who had shot me. They were standing nearby, satisfaction on their visible faces as they prepared to leave our village and move on to their next target. But I could see into their hearts, could perceive the spiritual darkness that had consumed them, the way their religious extremism had become a shield against the very love of God they claimed to represent. These men believe they are serving Allah, Jesus explained, but they have been deceived by the enemy of souls who uses religious fervor to justify hatred and murder. They need to encounter the same love you have experienced, the same truth that has transformed your understanding. The revelation that even these violent extremists were loved by God and in need of salvation rather than condemnation challenged everything I thought I understood about justice and mercy. But then Jesus showed me something that made my heart ache with longing to return to the physical world. A group of Christian aid workers had heard about the shooting and were making their way to our village, despite the obvious danger to their own lives. These were the same people I had once despised and reported to authorities, but now I could see their true motivation, a love for Jesus that compelled them to serve even their enemies. These servants of mine will arrive within the hour, Jesus revealed. They carry medical equipment that could potentially save your life if your spirit returns to your body soon enough. But more importantly, they carry testimonies that will help your family understand what has happened to you in this place. I could see that these aid workers had been praying for my family specifically, asking God to use even this tragedy for His purposes. The vision shifted to show me the future that awaited if I chose to return to my earthly existence. I watched myself recovering from my wounds, but more significantly, I saw the ministry that would emerge from this near-death experience. I witnessed myself sharing my testimony with other Muslim women, seeing their faces transform as they heard about the love of Jesus from someone who had once shared their exact religious background and cultural understanding. Your testimony will reach places where traditional missionaries could never go, Jesus explained, showing me scenes of underground house churches that would emerge throughout Iraq and neighboring countries. Muslim women who would never listen to a Western Christian will hear your story with open hearts because you have walked in their shoes, lived in their world, understood their deepest spiritual longings. I saw myself speaking to refugee women in camps across the Middle East, sharing not just the story of my death and resurrection, but the deeper truth about God's love that I had discovered in that eternal realm. I watched as women who had lost everything in the Syrian civil war, the Iraqi conflict, and the Afghan upheaval found hope and healing through understanding that their suffering had not been forgotten by God. The enemy intended to use your death to destroy faith and spread fear, Jesus continues, but I will use your resurrection to plant seeds of hope in the darkest places. This is how my kingdom advances, not through political power or military force, but through transformed lives sharing authentic love. The resistance I felt to this calling was overwhelming. Lord, how can I leave this place of perfect peace to return to a world of pain, persecution, and doubt? Here with you, everything makes perfect sense. There, I will face rejection from my family, exile from my community, and constant danger from Islamic extremists who will view me as an apostate deserving of death. Jesus reached out and touched what would have been my face if I had possessed physical form. The contact sent waves of strength and courage through my entire being, along with a deeper understanding of what love truly requires. My daughter, staying here would indeed be easier for you, but it would not be the path of love. Love always chooses to serve others rather than to serve itself. Your family needs to understand what you have experienced. Your community needs to hear this testimony. The lost and seeking throughout the Islamic world need to know that I am real and that I love them. He showed me one final vision that sealed my willingness to return. I saw my 3 children as adults, all of them following Jesus because of the testimony they would hear from their mother who had died and returned with proof of his reality. I watched them serving other Muslim families, sharing the same love they had received, carrying the message of God's grace to places where it had never been heard. This is why you must return, Amina, Jesus said with finality that carried the authority of heaven itself. Your most important work still lies ahead of you. The moment Jesus spoke his final words of commissioning, I felt an irresistible force begin to pull me away from that realm of perfect love and into the crushing limitations of physical existence. The transition was violent and jarring, like being compressed from an infinite ocean of consciousness into the confines of a single drop of water. Every expanded understanding I had gained, every truth that had been revealed, had to somehow squeeze back into the limited capacity of a human brain and nervous system. The descent through dimensions felt like falling through layers of reality, each one more dense and restrictive than the last. The perfect communication I had experienced with Jesus, that direct transmission of truth from mind to mind and heart to heart, was replaced by the clumsy inadequacy of human language. The pure love that had surrounded me like breathable atmosphere was suddenly filtered through the emotional limitations of flesh and blood. Then came the pain, excruciating, overwhelming pain that exploded through my chest as my heart suddenly lurched back to life after 31 minutes of complete stillness. The sensation was like being struck by lightning from the inside, every nerve ending in my body screaming back to consciousness simultaneously. My lungs, which had been still for over half an hour, suddenly convulsed with desperate hunger for oxygen, causing me to gasp with such violence that my entire body jerked upward from the makeshift stretcher where I had been placed. The sound that escaped from my throat was part scream, part sob, part victory cry. My eyes flew open to see unfamiliar faces staring down at me in shock and amazement. These were not the ISIS militants who had shot me or even my grieving family members, but Christian aid workers who had arrived at our village and were attempting to provide medical assistance to the victims of the shooting. My first word upon returning to the land of the living was Jesus, spoken with such clarity and conviction that it sent shockwaves through everyone present. The Muslim medical volunteers who had been assisting with recovery efforts stepped back in confusion and alarm, while the Christian aid workers fell to their knees in worship, recognizing immediately that they were witnessing a miraculous resurrection. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a British emergency physician who had been working in Iraqi refugee camps for 3 years, later told me that my case was medically impossible according to every principle of medicine she had studied. According to their equipment, my heart had been completely still for 31 minutes, with no brain activity detected for the final 20 minutes. By every scientific standard she knew, I should have been brain dead even if my heart could somehow be restarted. Yet here I was, not only alive but completely lucid, speaking coherently about an encounter with Jesus Christ that had occurred during the time my body had shown no signs of life. My vital signs, which should have been weak and irregular after such trauma, were stronger than they had been before the shooting. The bullet wound in my chest, which should have required immediate surgery, had somehow sealed itself and was healing at a rate that defied medical explanation. The Christian aid workers who witnessed my resurrection immediately recognized the significance of what had occurred. They had been praying specifically for my family ever since hearing about the shooting, asking God to use even this tragedy to reveal His love and truth. Now they found themselves in the position of helping to care for a Muslim woman who had returned from death with a testimony about Jesus that would revolutionize their understanding of how God works in the Islamic world. But my family's reaction was far more complicated and painful than I had anticipated. When Ahmad was finally allowed to see me at the medical station that had been set up in our village, his initial relief and joy at my survival quickly gave way to horror and confusion as I shared what I had experienced during my time in the eternal realm. "The doctors say you were dead for over 30 minutes, he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of hope and fear. "What happened to you, Amina? Where did you go?" When I began to describe my encounter with Jesus, his face went pale and his hands began to shake. The wife he had known for 15 years, the devoted Muslim woman who had borne his children and supported his ministry, was now speaking about the very figure he had spent his career teaching people to reject. "You are confused," he insisted, his voice growing more desperate with each word I spoke. "The trauma of being shot has damaged your mind. You are speaking blasphemy against Allah and the Prophet. This cannot be real." But even as he spoke these words of denial, I could see in his eyes that he recognized the fundamental change that had occurred in me. The fearful, anxious woman he had married had been replaced by someone who radiated peace and joy despite having just survived an assassination attempt. My 3 children's reactions were perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of my return to earthly life. Fatima, my 8-year-old daughter, listened to my story with wide-eyed wonder, asking innocent questions about what Jesus looked like and whether heaven was really as beautiful as I described. But Omar, my 6-year-old son, was confused and frightened by the conflict between what his mother was saying and what his father had taught him about Islamic truth. Little Zara, barely 4 years old, simply climbed into my lap and whispered, "Mama, I'm glad you came back from visiting the nice man." Her innocent acceptance of my experience stood in stark contrast to the theological crisis that was tearing apart the adults in my family. The Islamic community's response to my resurrection and testimony was swift and brutal. Within days of my return to consciousness, word of what I was saying had spread throughout our region. The local Imam, a close friend of my husband's for many years, declared that I was either suffering from mental illness caused by my traumatic experience or had been possessed by evil spirits that were using my near-death state to spread Christian lies. Ahmad was given an ultimatum by the Islamic authorities in our area: either convince his wife to recant her testimony about Jesus or face permanent exile from the community and loss of his position as a religious leader. The pressure on him was enormous, coming not just from religious officials but from his own extended family, who saw my testimony as a betrayal of everything they held sacred. For 3 weeks, I lived in a terrible limbo, caught between the eternal truth I had experienced and the earthly relationships that defined my entire existence. Ahmad begged me daily to claim that my visions had been hallucinations, to return to Islamic worship, to help him salvage what was left of our family's reputation and future. My heart broke watching him struggle between his love for me and his commitment to the faith that had shaped his entire identity. The breaking point came when I realized that my compromise was actually preventing the very people I loved most from encountering the truth that had set me free. During a particularly intense argument with Ahmad about my refusal to renounce my testimony, I saw the same spiritual darkness in his eyes that I had witnessed in the ISIS militants. Religious fear had replaced love, theological pride had overcome genuine seeking, and the very faith that was supposed to bring him closer to God was actually separating him from divine truth. Look inside your own heart right now, friend. Are you running from truth because it challenges everything you thought you knew about God? Or are you running toward truth regardless of what it might cost you. That moment of decision, standing in my modest village home with my husband demanding that I choose between Jesus and my family, was when I finally understood what Jesus had meant when he said that following him might require leaving everything behind. The Christian aid workers who had witnessed my resurrection offered to help me and my children escape to a refugee camp in Jordan, where we could live safely while I decided how to move forward with my new faith. The decision to accept their offer was the most difficult choice I had ever made, knowing that it meant leaving behind not just my husband but my entire cultural identity, my extended family, and the only life I had ever known. As we prepared to leave our village under cover of darkness, Ahmad made one final plea for me to stay and recant my testimony. "Choose your family, Amina," he said with tears streaming down his face. "Choose the life we built together, the children who need their father, the community that raised you. Forget about this Jesus and come home." But I had seen too much, experienced too much, been transformed too completely to turn back now. "I cannot forget Jesus any more than I can forget my own name," I told him. "He is not just something I believe about God, he is God himself, and someday, my beloved husband, I pray that you will meet him too." The journey to the refugee camp was terrifying and heartbreaking, but it was also the beginning of the most purposeful period of my life. Within weeks of our arrival, I began sharing my testimony with other Muslim women who had fled the violence in Iraq and Syria. Many of them had lost everything just as I had, and their hearts were open to hearing about a God who understood suffering and offered hope beyond their current circumstances. My name is Amina Hassan. I lost everything earthly the moment that bullet struck me in a dusty Iraqi village, but in that same moment, I found eternal treasure that no one can ever take away. Every Muslim woman reading this, Jesus knows your name, your pain, your secret longings for a love that will never fail you. You don't have to die to meet him, but you do have to be willing to let him change you completely.